able to see you. And
no, that's fine.
You can change your view as well.
Yes, I've done that.
So right now you can see me full screen, I'm sure.
I can, yes.
Right, so we can do that. And in case you want, if you want to see whoever is there, you have this gallery view.
Yes, that's fine. Yeah, I wasn't getting that earlier, but for some reason it's working now.
Yeah, some reason it's working.
Ma'am, we are live now.
Wonderful. We are live. Yeah, so we will wait one more. Nidhi, has Nayar ma'am joined? Just check, please.
No, ma'am.
So I think we'll begin now. Nidhi, shall we begin?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So good evening, everyone. On behalf of L.A.D and Srimati Women, I welcome you all on this virtual platform at the first Dr. Kamala Narayanan Memorial Lecture. We are very privileged to have with us Arundhati Subramaniam to deliver the first memorial lecture. Welcome to L.A.D College, Arundhati.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I welcome the Director of Women's Education Society, Dr. Shamila Nayar, the Principal of our college, Dr. Deepali Kotwal, Dr. Harsha Jharia, Chief Administrative Officer, our Vice Principals, Dr. Pooja Pathak and Alka Dhonge. I welcome all of you, my colleagues, our students who are here this evening from across India and abroad. Our alumni have joined us. I thank all the participants who have registered for this in such large numbers, and they will be soon joining us as and when their workday permits. I thank you all for being with us today as we remember the late Dr. Kamala Narayanan. She would have been 84 years old today. Dr. Kamala Narayanan, let me tell you a little bit about her. She was the head of the Department of English in our college and a well-beloved teacher. She was very meticulous in her work and a passionate teacher. In the department, she was always warm and very friendly with her colleagues, very protective of them. English departments the world over, across the world, are built up on rock-solid foundations of the dedication of the teachers who inhabit those spaces. Narayanan Madam, as she always was hailed, was a very strong presence on campus. She is remembered as a very good teacher, a supportive colleague, and a steady friend by everyone who was within her circle of influence. If the Department of English at L.A.D College in Nagpur is one of the strongest in Nagpur University, it is because of women like Dr. Kamala Narayanan, who worked with zeal and enthusiasm at everything. Her teaching and her scholarship has established very high standards of excellence with commitment in the department. Permit me to use a cliche when talking about Narayanan Madam. She had great qualities of both head and heart. Narayanan ma'am, as everyone knew her in the college, she knew everyone in the college personally. And she would make it a point to remember every major and minor happening in their lives. Warm and human. She wore her heart on her sleeve. She was my first HOD from 1991 to 97 till the time she retired. And so today I remember her fondly and I pay my respects to her memory. Therefore, when the Department of English of L.A.D. College thought of instituting a lecture series, it had to be in her name. Our former head and vice principal of the college, one who gave of herself so generously. She gave so much to her own subject, English literature, so well. And so therefore, it is also a great honor for the department that a Sahitya Akademi Awardee for Poetry in English will be the inaugural speaker today. I recognize the presence of our principal, Dr. Deepali Kotwal, and our vice principals. Our director, Dr. Shamila Nayar, has joined us. Good evening, ma'am. I invite her, our former and now Director and Secretary of Women's Education Society, and more importantly for us in the department, our former colleague, who is herself a published poet. I invite her to say a few words. Dr. Shamila Nayar. Ma'am, you're on mute.
Okay. Thank you, Ruta. And first and foremost, thank Arundhati Subramaniam for having taken time off to join all of us. We are really privileged and honored by your presence, and looking forward to your talk. I'm so happy that our mentor and teacher, a former teacher, Dr. Kamala Narayanan, who was also my first head, the way Ruta has described her, she was erudite and compassionate, and a human being whom we could all emulate. She mentored so many of us. And the best thing is that we took pride in the fact that we were picked by her to form a class and a league by ourselves. L.A.D. was one of the best English departments, being humbly modest about everything, but that was the way we were recognized around. So we are happy right now that this has been initiated by the Department of English, and we are sure this is going to continue as something that is going to go on for years to come. And the footprints that she has left behind will be remembered in future also. So I congratulate the Department of English for the initiative, and let's hope this will be something will be a benchmark for times to come. Thank you so much.
I think you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nayar. We will indeed, we do remember her so very fondly, like you said, and she was really a person who rather she made sure that we were bound together with ties that cannot be broken and will always be remembered. Yes, we were the best department of English in the university. I think we still are. So thanks to all those people who came before us. We are what we are here today and doing a lot of good work, remembering what came before us. So memory and foundations are very, very important. And now I turn therefore to Arundhati. As I said, Arundhati, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be the first speaker for this memorial lecture. Your very presence today has both electrified and stabilized this virtual space. I wish we could have met in person, like I said, and our audience could have taken in the energy you always exude. Let me tell you a little briefly about Arundhati. I would like to say everything that I know and we all know, but I shall try and limit myself. Arundhati Subramaniam is described by the Hindu as one of the finest poets writing in India today. She is the award-winning author of 13 books of poetry and prose. Her most recent award is the Sahitya Akademi Award for 2020 for her book, When God is a Traveler, which was also the season choice of the Poetry Book Society and also shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. Her most recent poetry collection, Love Without a Story, which came out in 2019, was described as a breathtaking and heartwarming book by the Poetry Book Society Bulletin, and as a book by a unique poet of our times in a league all by herself by Indian literature. Arundhati wears many hats and has been active over the years as a cultural curator, poetry editor, and critic. She's an accomplished Bharatanatyam dancer. Arundhati is widely anthologized and translated. She's been invited to poetry conferences and festivals all over the world, but I'm particularly interested in Turkey, China, West Africa, Israel, as well as our neighbors, Nepal and Bangladesh. Her poems are now found in translation in several languages, including Hindi, Tamil, Italian, German, French, and Spanish. She's won many other prizes as well, and fellowships. The International Il Chepo Prize, or Chepo, I don't know how to pronounce that. The International Il Chepo Prize, I suppose, for poetry in Italy. The Z Women's Award for Literature, the Raza Award for Poetry, and the Mystic Kalinga Award, the Trinity Arts Festival Lifetime Achievement Award, and the Homi Bhabha Visiting Arts and Charles Wallace Fellowships. As prose writer, her books include a recent book of essays on contemporary women on sacred journeys, women who wear only themselves, which came out this year. And the book has won wide acclaim and is gaining a large readership. We also know of the bestseller, Sadhguru, More Than a Life. She's edited an anthology of Bhakti poetry called Eating God, and edited another book on sacred journeys called Pilgrims India, a Sahitya Akademi anthology of post-independence Indian poetry in English, Another Country, and co-edited with Jerry Pinto, Confronting Love. As an independent curator, this was so interesting to read. She created a widely acclaimed festival of dance and sacred poetry in 2014, entitled Stark Raving Mad. In 2019, she curated another, in 2014, that was in 2014. In 2019, she curated another successful festival of music and female mystic poetry, Wild Women, at the NCPA, and the Mystic Kalinga Festival around Bhakti poetry in Bhubaneswar, Odisha. It is so interesting to even listen to those names. The words as they trip off my tongue themselves are so very, very enticing. She's been a long-standing journalist on the performing arts and literature. She's been writing since 1989. She's been a columnist with Time Out, Mumbai, Indian Express, New Women. She divides her time between New York, Mumbai, and Chennai. We warmly welcome you, Arundhati. And Arundhati today will be speaking on what poetry means to me. Over to you, Arundhati.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruta. And thank you to all of you, Shamila Nayar and everyone else who's present here, your head of department, all your colleagues, your students, and all the others who've actually taken the trouble to be here today. I wish this had been live in-person interaction. And I just do think that Zoom in so many ways is a great possibility, but is also something that makes me acutely aware of how difficult it is to just create a kind of joint energy space for all of us, where we can all be together in a certain spirit of kinship as lovers of poetry. But since that is not possible, I will not lament the great possibilities that Zoom has brought into our lives. I will not in any way trivialize those. But what I would like to do is to perhaps choose to make this session just as informal as possible. I would perhaps have approached this somewhat differently had we been live, but I'm just going to talk about poetry and what it means to me and allow that to unfold. There is no prepared talk here that I'm going to be looking at. I just want to share with you certain moments in my life that have been pivotal in the way in which I understand poetry and have shaped the way in which I look at poetry. But before that, I just wanted to say to Ruta, who very generously called me an accomplished Bharatanatyam dancer, I wish that were true. It is not, unfortunately. I certainly learned Bharatanatyam, but I was never a stage performer. I wrote on dance and consoled myself with that. And that has sustained me in many ways. I also want to say, before I start, that the fact that I'm at this inaugural Kamala Narayanan lecture makes me very, very pleased, because from the little that I hear of her, it feels like she was someone who, in many ways, was a deeply cohesive force in this department. And in just so many ways, people carry a certain radiance into whatever they do and ignite people around them as well with a certain joy and enthusiasm and a sense of belonging. So it feels like she was one such person. Delighted to be here for that. Why poetry? I have talked often about what poetry means to me, but sometimes the best way to talk about it is to just start with a poem. And that always makes me feel like less of an imposter when I'm actually reading a poem. So I'm going to read you a poem from my second book. It was written a while ago, but it's a poem that addresses the central question of why on earth some of us sit down and bother to write poetry when there are so many reasons militating against it. What are the reasons? We'll come to those in a moment, but first the poem. Sometimes when we poets get together, we wonder why on earth we're doing this, why we're not doing something more glamorous, more lucrative. And then, of course, we go back and write poems. For a poem still unborn. Over tea, we wonder why we write poetry. 10 people read it anyway. 3 are committed in advance to disliking it. 3 like it and wouldn't mind telling you so, but don't know how. 2 have leaking taps and traffic jams to think about. Another is busy preparing questions about pat ironies and identity politics. The 10th is wondering whether you wear contact lenses. And we, as soiled as anyone else, in a world addicted to carbohydrates and conversations without pauses, still groping among sunsets and line lengths and slivers of hope, for a moment unstained by the wild contagion of habit. Why on earth would some of us, I sometimes ask myself, still grope for those elusive verbal moments somewhere between sunsets and line lengths and slivers of hope? Why would we do it? There is no pragmatic reason to be doing it. Poetry doesn't, from what we know, it doesn't seem to improve the GNP. It doesn't seem to reverse the Arctic meltdown. It doesn't seem to even be capable of alleviating a toothache. For poets themselves, publishers are few and far between. Royalty checks are few and far between. Readers and buyers of poetry are few and far between. Because one of the great paradoxes of the practice of poetry is that almost everyone has written a poem, at least by the time they reach the age of 16, often even written in blood and sent off to some love interest who obstinately looks the other way. Everyone has written a poem because in some way the emotional thermostat seems to require us to turn to poetry at some point or the other. But the paradox is that those who write poetry don't necessarily become readers of poetry. And so poetry is one of those forms where that everyone has practiced, but almost no one goes out there and actually buys a book of poetry. The result of that, of course, is that those royalty checks are not forthcoming. And there's also American market research that I remember reading about years ago that claimed that poets die sooner than other species of writers. So really, and it has to be true, it's American, it's an American survey. So why on earth are we writing poetry? I remember many years ago when I worked at the Arts Center that Ruta mentioned, the National Center for the Performing Arts. I remember an elderly colleague coming up to me and saying, in a very well-intentioned way, she said, you write poetry, how nice. Now, when are you going to write your first novel? And implicit in that, of course, was the assumption that poetry is the form from which you graduate. You move from the adolescent genre to the adult form, which is the novel. And in the 90s, which is the time that I was emerging as a young student out into the literary world, there was every reason to be writing the novel. The Indian English novel had found its place in the sun. Novelists were being, at least some of them, were being celebrated and feted, and it was all very wonderful. But poets, on the other hand, from India, especially Anglophone poets, were seen as a somewhat invisible species, that is, they were not seen at all, or else they were sort of creaky specimens, not to be taken terribly seriously, apart from a couple of names. Why poetry? And that brings me to just 5 moments that I'm going to share with you. And I share them not to just offer autobiography, I share them because I hope that they will somehow resonate with moments you've had. And I know I'm speaking to a very varied group of people, so I'm trying to talk to those amongst you who are already committed rasikas of poetry, those of you who are practitioners, those of you who perhaps are sometimes unwilling students of poetry, sometimes perhaps chafing at the ways in which poetry is imparted. I'm trying to talk to as many of you as possible, but I'm going to stay true to those 5 moments. And I hope at least one of them will strike a chord with each one of you. So there are times when I wonder why on earth I'm writing poetry, because I'm inundated with manuscripts, I'm surrounded by words, I'm tired of the sense of self-importance that sometimes seems to pervade literary circuits. And when I need a palate cleanser, when I need to remind myself of why it really matters, I turn to these 5 moments. The first moment is when I was emerging into this verbal universe, around the age of 3, I would imagine, when I remember hearing bits of doggerel in Hindi, in English, in Tamil. I grew up Tamilian in Mumbai, so life around me was this glorious, multilingual mess, a delightful mess. I grew up with a mother who'd grown up in Delhi, and so there was Hindi in the household, there was Tamil in this household, there was English in this household. Both my parents were second generation English speakers. And there was, of course, Mumbai itself. You just had to step out of your door and you heard Gujarati and Marathi, and of course, that very wonderful singular linguistic construct, Bombaya Hindi, which was a special and wonderful organism as well. And so I grew up in this world, not quite knowing where one language ended and another began. And I remember this early introduction into the world of verse. And there were fragmentary glimpses of meaning, because I didn't understand very much anyway. But what I do remember was this great sense of delight at language that was capable of soaring and swooping and diving and careening. It felt like I knew at a very early stage, and I think all of us did, without it actually having to be told and without being able to articulate it. I think I knew the difference in that inarticulate, nameless way between poetry and prose very early. Prose, as I saw it then, was the somewhat stodgy, transactional, content-driven, pedestrian language that grown-ups spoke. Whereas poetry was this high-velocity, kinetic, unpredictable, sometimes dangerous, exuberant language. This was a place where language seemed to behave differently. And I sensed that. And I realized, and I think I'd invite you to think back on that time, when we heard rhymes like, hey, diddle, diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon. Or Edward Lear's The Owl and the Pussycat went to sea on a beautiful pea green boat. They took some honey and plenty of money wrapped up in a 5-pound note. Looking back at that, I don't think anyone ever had to sit down and tell me, this is nonsense verse. No one had to. Because as a child, there was an exuberant recognition of the fact that this was playful language. Yes, one part of me worried about whether that honey would stain the 5-pound note, and another part of me did think that the owl and the pussycat were a strange couple, and another part of me probably did think that the dish that ran away with the spoon was engaging in a somewhat odd elopement. But there was a part of me that responded to this, knowing that meaning was just a small part of the enjoyment of poetry. And I remind myself of that today because there are times I encounter people at workshops who tell me that while they love poetry, there is part of them that is actually resistant to it. And another lot is honest enough to admit that they've actually stopped reading it because they don't understand it, or some of it. And the immediate response is, I don't understand it, therefore there's something wrong with me, or I don't understand it and therefore there's something wrong with the poem. And I would invite you to just remember those moments when it didn't matter that one didn't understand. One loved something, one loved the form, one knew how to love the form anyway, and one didn't have to be trained at that point to recognize it for what it was. So the first moment I really want to share with you is this, the sense of poetry as choreographed language, the sense of poetry as dance. When I watched my first dance performance and I saw a dancer on one part of the stage and the very next moment in the other, it just took my breath away because I wondered how she'd got there. And then I realized that that is pretty much the way poetry operates. It doesn't join the dots necessarily, but it's capable of leaping from one place to the other and taking your breath away in the process. So it helps me, even today, to think of poetry as language that dances, this language that is high octane, unpredictable, exciting language. And that brings me to the second moment that I'd like to share with you. This happened around the time that I was 12 or 13. And I was in my grandfather's home in Chennai, in Madras. And I remember pulling a book down from his, he had a room full of book-lined shelves. And I pulled down a book and I opened a page. I opened to a page that said the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And I learned that this was a poem written by someone called T.S. Eliot. Now, I wouldn't have been able to tell you whether T.S. Eliot was a man or a woman. I wouldn't have been able to tell you whether the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock referred to a particular person whom I ought to have known about. I certainly didn't know who this was. It was much later that I learned to approach Eliot with a certain weak-kneed reverence that seemed to be appropriate for students of literature approaching this messiah of modernism. But at that time, all I remember was this thrilling sense of homecoming. I wouldn't have known. I wouldn't have been able to stand up in any class and tell anyone what that poem meant. I didn't know. But I knew irrefutably that I was in the presence of poetry. And I had a sense that this is where I wanted to be, here in this place of language that was clarity and mystery all at once, where there was this sense of rushing air and music. And this brought me my second insight, a second moment that I realized was important to me, that if poetry was a kind of dance, verbal dance, I could also see it as a kind of music. When it comes to music, I personally often don't know the exact raga that's at work. I often don't know the exact tal. On occasion, I do. I don't know the mathematics of music, but my capacity to respond to it is very real. And I would never want to let go of that. And this is how I felt about my first encounter with that T.S. Eliot poem, that I recognized it even before I understood it. I was able to respond to it without being able to articulate my response to it at all, but I responded. I say this because I still encounter many students who tell me that they wrestle with some of the ways in which poetry was imparted, particularly in school. And I certainly know that while I had some magnificent teachers of poetry in school, I also had a couple of singularly unimaginative ones who asked me this question that always sent a shiver down my timbers. They asked this question. I would first have read the poem, I'd have loved the poem, and then would come the question. What is the poet trying to say? Now, this particular question would immediately bring this pall of gloom, at least over me, and I think into many students in the classroom, because of a reason I discovered much later. That is, a poet is never trying to say something. A poet is simply saying it. And we forget that and often create this divide between form and content with a question like that, which splinters the essential, the integral compound that poetry is, the compound that brings style and substance together into one absolutely inextricable whole. We shatter that when we ask this question, and somewhere along the way, that essential enjoyment that we've all known, I believe, that enjoyment of poetry as verbal dance and verbal music, which no one really had to tell us to enjoy, that sensuality is sometimes deprived. We are deprived of that sensuality. And I think this is the unfortunate schism that we sometimes create between sociology and sensuousness. And I believe that part of the reason why my heart sinks at the ways in which poetry is sometimes written about is because it is simply talked about in terms of its sociology. It's simply talked about in terms of the background in which, the context in which the poem was written, which is important. It is not unimportant. But somewhere along the way, we lose the rasa of it all. And I do believe that some school teachers have a lot to answer for by asking this one question that tyrannized several generations, certainly mine. I've always gone back to a line from the American poet and critic Randall Jarrow. And this sustained me as I was emerging as a student of literature from my BA, and I think it was in my MA years that I read Randall Jarrow. And he says in a particular line, he says, it's not that people have stopped reading modern poetry because they find it difficult. He says it's because people have stopped reading poetry that they find it difficult. And to me, this line stayed with me. It stayed with me as a reminder that part of our problem is that we are encouraged by the world around us to approach everything, and it's not just poetry. We are encouraged to approach the world, relationships, everything around us in terms of what can we get out of it? How can we extract what counts from it? This was the problem with being asked, what is the poet trying to say? The assumption is that the poet cannot say it. She or he can only grunt it out in little pellets of language, that you in your superior wisdom as a student can sit down and decode and render in flowing prose paragraphs that you later submit to an examiner. And of course, you get marked for it, whereas the poet, poor chap, didn't know how to say it. And the only thing that really counts, the assumption is the content, which can be picked out like raisins from a bun, and you can brandish them and say, this is what counts. This idea that the entire world is really meant to be decoded, the entire world is meant to be paraphrased, is meant to be understood even, to me is a somewhat impoverished idea, because it suggests that we all want to live in a universe that is fully illuminated, that we all want to live in 100-watt illumination all the time. And it overlooks the fact that a part of us responds to mystery. A part of us responds to wonder. A part of us responds to, in fact, the absence of clarity, the absence of light. We want that play of shadow and light. And that's what makes a poem work. To my mind, that's what makes the world work. That's what makes people work. We don't always understand them, but that never stops us from loving them. So that's the second moment. Thinking of poetry as a kind of music and to enjoy that. That for me was an important second moment in my life in terms of my understanding of it. The third moment happened later, when I was part of a writer's circle in Mumbai called the Poetry Circle. And this was the time when I was taking poetry very seriously as a form. And of course, I discovered that it was what many of you know it is, those of you who actually write it or enjoy it. The fact is that poetry is the most direct verbal route to oneself, and the most pleasurable verbal route to oneself that one knows. At least that's how it felt to me. It was a place where you could express yourself, but it was also a place where you could discover yourself. All of you who've ever kept a journal know this, that you sit down in a moment of great rage and you write a whole page in your journal, and at the end of the page, already something has shifted. That rage has been transformed. That is the alchemy of writing. And poetry for me was the place where that alchemy was in great evidence, always. But while it was also about self-expression and self-discovery, it was about self-revelation and self-construction, if you will, I also realized that poetry was about craft. And this was something that I realized during my years of what I call poetic apprenticeship. Recognizing that language was a kind of, not just dance and music, but language was also craft. Language was a kind of chemical. I realized that it had chemical properties. It was like being in the laboratory of language and realizing that being a poet was also about enjoying being alchemist in some way. I realized that if you apply great heat and pressure to language, its chemical properties change. I realized that if you take language out of one context into another, throw it up in the air and put on a spotlight, language turns performative. Language can do different things. And this was my discovery. I still remember the time when I read Nissim Ezekiel's poem, Irani Cafe Instructions. I don't know how many of you have read it. If you haven't, I'd suggest you go back and pick it up again. It's a playful piece. It's just a series of instructions that the poet has seen put up on a board in an Irani cafe. Now, you could wonder, where is the poem? He's just picked it up from somewhere and turned it into, and claims that it is a poem. Is it a poem? And my response to that, and I realized this as I was reading poetry, is that it is a poem because the poet, this particular person, found it. It was a poem waiting to be found. What he did was to pluck it out of there, put the light on it, turn on a spotlight and give it to you. And suddenly, this little piece of absurdity really becomes a very warm, affectionate tribute to Irani cafes, to an entire way of being, to the city of Mumbai, and much else. So these were some of the discoveries I was making. And I would say this to all of you. I know there are some students amongst you as well, many students who probably write poetry. And I want to say to you that this period of apprenticeship, I realized, was very important to me. And I would say that it's important for any writer, any artist of any kind. You go through spells, I discovered, of what I call seance, when I was channeling voices that weren't my own. So I didn't sound like myself at all. I went through periods of trying to write like those I admired, and often ended up sounding like those poets I disliked. And there were times of what I call ventriloquism, when someone else had written a poem that I believed belonged to me. And I would writhe in envy because the poem had got there first and it ought to have been mine. So all these were very routine. And I would say they're phases that almost every artist goes through, certainly something that every writer goes through at some point or the other. But at this point, I'm going to pause. I've moved, as I see it, from the verbal dance of poetry to the verbal music of poetry to poetry as craft. And as I speak of craft, before I move on to my last 2 points of what shifted the ways in which I looked at poetry, I want to just pause and say a few things about craft, because I feel that very often what we need to talk about are just the resources of language and the ways in which they change the way we look at a form. So I realized poetry was enjoyment, but I also began to ask myself, why? Why do I feel drawn to one poem? What is it at work there that makes me feel invited? And what is it that doesn't quite seem to work? Why is it that in some cases I don't feel as drawn, as invited? And I realized that I realized just a few things that are part of the resources of every poet's toolkit. I realized that the finest work, for instance, the work that spoke to me, was work that used metaphor, that worked with image. And I realized that image was in fact the basis of some of the finest poetry. And while I'm drawn to what I call the poetry of statement on occasion, the poems that remain with me, I realized, were those in which image was paramount. And the example that has always remained with me is the Margaret Atwood poem, which some of you will know, just 4 lines. And I often mention this to students at workshops. You could sit and write an entire essay on doomed love. You could write a novel about failed love affairs, or you could write these 4 lines. You fit into me like a hook into an eye. You fit into me like a hook into an eye, a fish hook, an open eye. Now, I mention this because it's a small example, but it is for me the example of what poetry can do. It doesn't merely describe what is happening, it takes you there. So it's very difficult, even today, for me to utter those words without flinching at the thought of that fish hook and the open eye. And in the course of 4 lines, This poem travels from an image of very cozy domesticity, the hook into an eye, that's how you fit into me, to this fish hook and the open eye. This is the power of image. And this is why I remind myself of this even today, that the image is always that much wiser than we are. And that's the reason we remember the image for its viscerality in a way that all the abstract nouns of the world often cannot accomplish. The second discovery I made about the resources of a poet were about tone. Without tone, a poem collapses. This is something I had never quite understood until I began to actually work with poetry, actually wrote poems. And the poem for me that comes to mind, which I want to share with you, is a poem by a poet who lived many centuries ago, an Indian poet called Annamacharya. And I mention this poem because it's a favorite of mine. Annamacharya was a sacred poet, a bhakti poet, who wrote poems to his personal god of Tirupati. And in this particular poem, he has a goddess, the goddess Alamelumanga, talking about her god. She's telling a friend about her god. And what always amazes me about this poem is its tone. The same line is repeated, but each time it is repeated, you see the way in which the tone shifts. And you realize that although the goddess is saying and saying again, he's the master, he's my master, he's the boss, you know exactly what she means. That's what tone can do to a poem. That's the texture it can bring into a poem. The tone is the emotional or psychological axis of the poem. Here's the poem, if I can remember all of it. He's the master. What can I say when he says I'm better than the others? I don't even have to ask. He takes whatever I say as a command. Why should I brag? My husband is under my thumb. He's the master. He's always in my arms. I'm always laughing with him. He's the god on the hill. And I'm Alamelumanga. Do I have to make a statement? He's my slave. He's the master. Every time this he's the master is repeated, I realized in the course of this poem, there is irony, there is this constant oscillation between the sensual, this view of the master or this beloved as your own. These are the politics of intimacy being played between them. At the same time, he's also this, he is the divine himself. So this oscillation is possible to suggest only through tone. And this was yet another important discovery that I think for me was significant because I realized a lot of poems use rhythm and sound, but they don't necessarily speak of tone. And some of the finest poems, to my mind, bring tone into the question, into the picture. And of course, there were other resources. There was sound, rhythm. I realized that there is a reason why even today, for me, the sound of desolation is the sound of that verse in Coleridge. Alone, alone, all alone, alone on a wide, wide sea. And never a saint took pity on my soul in agony. It took me time to realize what was at work there and why the sound of emptiness, of separation, of utter abandonment. Why would that be synonymous for me with these lines? And I realized the ways in which sound was being used, the lapping of the waves, alone and alone. I could actually hear the waves. And that's yet another example of the many ways in which sound, tone, rhythm, surprise, all of them collude to make up a poem. I will never forget the time I first read the Shakespeare sonnet about my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. And I never forgot that line because it seemed to me to be the most bizarre thing to be saying. You're talking about your lover, but her eyes are not like the sun. And I'm not even getting into the whole story about who the dark lady was, none of that. I just know that this is a poet with such a keen understanding of what can turn so easily into cliche, that anti-romantic line stays with me, and it stays with this particular reader centuries later, because it flouts every convention that we associate with romantic love. This is not a mistress who walks 5 feet above the ground. This is a mistress who treads on the earth. That's where she treads. And every description of this woman, no, not blonde, not blue-eyed, none of those conventions of beauty of the time. Instead, everything overturned, subverted. These were the moments that stayed with me, because I realized these were poets drawing on the multiple resources of language. So I won't go into all of it, but the last resource I do want to mention, because I do think it's something that I'm still learning the importance of, is economy, distillation. When I first came across the haiku poet Basho and this particular haiku, I was probably 14. Basho says, "Old pond, leap, splash, a frog." I paused because that was the beginning of my understanding that language could be pared down to a point when so little needed to be said. You cut off the flab, you cut off the superfluity, and what's left is no understanding. We don't know when this was written. We don't know whether it was in Eastern or Western Japan, at what moment in the poet's life. We don't know where he was. All we know is that there was an old pond, a leap, a splash, a frog, which completely, again, shatters typical ideas of causality. It's not a frog and then the leap splash. It is the leap splash and then the frog. So it's the effect before the cause. And in doing that, there is a moment of stillness that the poet creates, which I haven't forgotten to this day. So this quality of distilling language, weeding out everything that is needless, in fact, ruthlessly pruning the utterance to what really counts. This, I realize, is the essence of poetry. I'm going to move on from craft to the fourth point that I want to share with you, which is really a poem. This happened when my first book was out, and it was well received. But I remember this particular critic, a Welsh critic, who said, "Good work, good work. But where is this? Is this really identifiably Indian?" And the question stayed with me because it resonated with questions I had as a curator and as a critic. And I was struck by the fact that it felt like the world was constantly looking for identifiably something, whether it's identifiably woman, identifiably of a particular, is a poem identifiably Hindu? Is it identifiably Muslim? Is it identifiably female, male, whatever? What have you, modern, traditional, postmodern? And I realized that I had a deep problem, as so many did, with gatekeepers. This was my fourth realization, that if language is verbal dance, and it is music, and it is craft, and it is self-expression, it is also politics. Poetry is politics, inescapably politics. And that sometimes I needed to turn into a gatekeeper myself in order to prevent other gatekeepers from decreeing how I should express myself. And this was true of everyone, that I realized that these were hard-won freedoms to speak the way we wanted, to say what we wanted to say, how we wanted to say it. And so this is the point at which I'm just going to pause, if I may, and read a poem to you. Just allows me to shift the tenor of things a bit. And I'm going to read this long rant poem, which I promised to finish quickly, and then we move to the fifth point, and I promise more stillness at the end of this session. And but it's time for a little savagery for now. A moment, 1 minute of savagery, and then we move on. So this is my rant. To the Welsh critic who doesn't find me identifiably Indian. You believe you know me, wide-eyed, ing-lit type, from a sun-scalded colony, reading my Keats, or is it yours? While my country detonates on your television screen. You imagine you've cracked my deepest fantasy. Oh, to be in an Edwardian vicarage, living out my dharma with every sip of dandelion tea and dreams of the weekend jumble sale. You may have a point. I know nothing about silly mid-offs. I stammer through my Tamil, and I long for a nirvana that is hermetic, odor-free, bottled in Switzerland, money back guaranteed. This business about language, how much of it is mine, how much yours, how much from the mind, how much from the gut, how much is too little, how much too much, how much from the salon, how much from the slum, how I say verisimilitude, how I say Brihadaranyaka, how I say Varaparam, it's all yours to measure. The pathology of my breath, the halitosis of gender, my homogenized plosives, about as rustic as a mouth-freshened global village. Arbiter of identity, remake me as you will. Write me a new alphabet of danger, a new patois to match the chola bronze of my skin. Teach me how to come of age in a literature you bark scratched into scripture. Smear my consonants with cow dung and turmeric and godhuli. Pity me, sweating, rancid, on the other side of the counter. Stamp my papers, leaves me a new anxiety, grant me a visa to the country of my birth. Teach me how to belong the way you do on every page of world history. So that was the rant, and it's time to move on to the last point that I'd like to share with you, the last moment. It happened to me around April 97, and I'm not going into the specifics of the experience itself. But what was important to me was a realization that came to me after this. It was for me my brush with a kind of emptiness, a great echoing emptiness. And as I emerged from that moment, I began to realize that it was actually a phase in my life. It lasted a little over a week, but it was a very definitive phase. As I emerged from that moment, I realized that poetry is, yes, sensual plenitude. Poetry is self-expression. Poetry is politics. Poetry is craft. But poetry is also the only verbal art that consciously embraces pauses, the only verbal art that consciously embraces silences. And this was my realization that all those blank spaces on a page of poetry mean. They may not mean something, but they are not there by accident. Those blank spaces on a page of poetry are the source of a poem's life energy. Without them, there would be no poem. I had thought of myself as this somewhat joyous alchemist of language working with rhythm. What is rhythm? But just sound and pause, sound and pause, sound and pause. But at this moment, when I was tripped up by a pause, I began to approach those pauses with a newfound respect. And to this day, I believe that those pauses have in fact changed the way in which I perhaps write poetry quite drastically. And so my final moment that I want to share is the fact that I realized that poems matter, not just for what they say. Poems matter, as I say in one of my poems, poems matter because they have holes. it's important for me never to forget that. And with that, I think I need to come to the end of this presentation. I just want to say, yes, there is no real reason to be writing poetry, but it's strange, isn't it, how in life's most extreme, most liminal moments, whether it's of great fear, great pain, bereavement, loss, joy, love, for some mysterious reason, it is poetry to which we turn. I believe it's for all those reasons I mentioned earlier. Above all, because it has that essential porosity, because poems have holes, because poems can leak into one's bloodstream and create deep, enduring shifts along our internal fault lines. Shifts that we are not often aware of at all. But that's the enduring way in which poetry can transform us. Thank you. Thank you for listening. I think there are some questions. Should I look at the questions?
There are, yeah, you can. But for a minute,
it's difficult. Yes, Ruta.
Yeah, I think I will be reading it out because that will save you the bother.
That's much easier, yeah.
But for me, I just want to pause for that little bit of half a minute just to take in whatever you have just said. It's
Thank you for the pause. I'm glad to know pauses are possible on Zoom as well. Thank you.
Perfectly possible. And I think your voice is, I mean, I am awash with just your voice, actually, Arundhati. It's liquid gold, whatever you say. And the 5 points and the 5 moments you let us in on your life. Thank you. 5 is a good number.
5 is a good number. Thank you. Thank you, Ruta.
And like I said, you electrify us as well as stabilize us. You're the stabilizer on the top of the fridge, which is humming with electricity. That never somehow take it away from me. I've listened to you. I've read you. I know you from so long ago as well. But I feel, and I'm sure everyone who comes into contact with you, Arundhati, they will feel this sense of connect. The poet that you are, the person that you have become from the college children that we once were. Thank you for being you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruta.
You do good.
For those of you who are listening in, Ruta, I knew Ruta a long time ago when we were both young, I think interesting, edgy young women studying for our MA. And we've lost touch after that, but it's been certain convergences that have happened at interesting points in our lives, I think. It's good to be reconnected.
Yeah. So with that little bit of pause as well as a personal pause for me, thank you so much for that. So I think we'll turn to lots of things which are happening on the chat box. And there are questions, Arundhati. You will take questions?
Mm-hmm. Happy to.
Yeah. So there is a question. I'll start with the ones which appear on the chat box first. So chronologically, let me take them. Prantik Banerjee, he says, back in the 1990s, poets did meet in poems. If your poems got published in journals such as Kavya Bharati, Poetry Society of India, Pen, Chandrabhaga, you felt you had arrived because they were being edited by Ezekiel, Mehrotra, Mahapatra. Do you see the lack of quality poetry journals now, despite the explosion of online poetry sites? We would like to know what you would say to young college poets who write and want to publish. Prantik is
question
himself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, clearly. Well, I'd say it's a good point. On the one hand, we all welcome, I certainly do, this great online, this detonation that seems to have happened where everyone's writing and everyone's being heard. I think many of us knew the pain of not feeling heard, not just being heard, but feeling it. I think many of us felt for a long time that those were difficult phases in one's life. The great difficulty of even being published, having a book out was a major thing at that time. And now it seems to have, yes, there is the accessibility, the democratization, all of which I welcome. At the same time, I think implicit in your question is a concern that I think many of us share, which is the loss of rigor, which I think many of us are concerned about, which is why I spent time talking at some length. This was an impromptu decision, actually, to talk at some length about craft, because I suddenly had the sense that it's important to be talking not just about the magic of verse, which is true, it exists, not just about the mystery of verse, which is true, it exists, but also about the manual labor, the riyaz that goes into the writing of poetry. And without that riyaz, there is no poem. Everyone could be a potential poet, but to actually realize that potential, that craft is vital. So I think it was important for me to talk about it because I wanted to suggest and remind particularly young people who are writing that craft is not a dirty word. The spontaneity and the magic of poetry is important, but so also is the craft. And as you work on your craft, you begin to realize that crafting is pleasurable. It's not an original moment of inspiration followed by penance when you're reworking your poem. There is the same sensuality, the same joy, the same excitement about rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands messy with language. That's a great and integral part of making a poem happen. So I'd say to young people, to answer your question, I'd say to young people, read widely, be as omnivorous a devourer of poetry as you can be. And don't forget that in being a practitioner, a true practitioner of poetry is also a rigorous reader. And the two go hand in hand.
If Prantik can switch on his video, maybe that will also be okay, so that because I'm going to take up another question or a comment which he has, because it's in line with what he's saying. So he's written, I think it was Joseph Brodsky who said, "I'm not a good writer, but a great editor of my own poems."
Mm-hmm.
You keep going back to your lines to do an Ezra Pound. Do you agree that a poem need not have a finished look at all? It need not be a perfect, bejeweled work of art.
It's a lovely question.
I
think it is, yes, it's absolute. As I said, I've already said, I certainly go back to my work. I believe in revisions and tweaking endlessly. But there's also the point when one realizes when one has to abandon a poem. And that's the line that I often like to quote and remind myself of, because we'd all like to turn out what we think is the immaculate product, but no such thing exists. So the idea is to keep working, but working on a poem doesn't necessarily mean polishing it. Working on a poem sometimes means knowing where to remove the polish, where to scrape off the veneer, allowing one very polished line to be followed by a jagged line. That's part of the texture, that's part of the grain of the poem that you want to achieve. So certainly not bejeweled all the time, but a hint of a jewel followed by the sense of what it's actually like to rub your palm across a non-acrylic surface, something grainy. So you want a mix of both, depending on what the demands of your poem are. And does one find it? That's the question. At times you do, and at other times you know you have to abandon it and start over. that old line of Paul Valeri's. You don't really finish a poem, you just abandon it.
You abandon it. And then Archibald MacNeish, I think, a poem does not need to mean, it just needs to be.
Yes, indeed.
And therefore, we can still escape the tyranny of school teachers. And therefore, I think even our students do not escape the tyranny that we impose on them as college teachers as well.
Yes, but I'm sure that college teaching has come a long way, and I'm sure with teachers like you and others, I'm sure it's come a long way since that particular kind of teacher who persecuted us.
Yes, true. But we were fortunate to have good teachers at college level. We definitely did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We have another question. Yes. Yeah, there is a question from T. Kanchana D. How should the raw thoughts and ideas to be penned down as a poem? Any steps to be followed? How different is the earlier formatted poem different from the recent ones of social media?
You know, Kanchana, is that her name?
Dr. T. Kanchana D. I'm not able to read the thing, but it's coming on my
so I'm going to take the
screen,
liberty of calling you Kanchana.
Yeah.
I'm not on social media very much, so I don't know what these new poems are. But let me say that your first half of your question, how to move from the raw thought, I think you said, to the finished product. My personal way is all I can share. My personal way would be to sit and write all that you must, and then to put it away. I put away whatever I write, all the fragments. I don't open that file on my computer, often for months on it. And I just allow fragments to accumulate and don't read them. And then I go back to them only when I've actually forgotten what I've written. And then I read. And with that distance comes a certain clarity. And I know then, or I have an inkling then, of what must stay and what is happily superfluous, what is absolutely dispensable. And that's the time to actually rip it all away. You must promise yourself, of course, that you'll use it somewhere else just to make yourself feel better. But that's the time to edit. That's the time to play the role that, was it Prantik? Was that his name? What he talks of, the editor, the role of the editor. When you cut and prune ruthlessly. And it's often through those acts of, there's the inspired eavesdropping on the self that I often call poet, what you think of as the original moment that gave rise to a poem. But all of that adds up, and you realize that something that you said 6 months ago ties in perfectly with what you said today. You believe in your mind, as all of us who kept journals believe, that these are totally different days. You're a different person, you're thinking different thoughts, but it's amazing how unoriginal we are sometimes. And we're actually saying the same thing in many ways, again and again. And that's the whole wonderful process of churning and allowing something distilled to emerge from that churn. So I'd say work piecemeal and allow the fragments to come together. Not all of them will fit, but some of them will.
I'll move on to the next, Dr. Balaji Navle. Which is the most fertile time for poetry? In the present time, we have hardly any epic poem.
Yes, I don't know. You mean the most fertile age, I imagine, that he may,
I think he's
so not
that.
Just personally, right? So
no.
Yes.
Fertile age, perhaps he meant. Fertile?
Yeah, the time, as in a historical time, yeah. I would say that, yes, but the epic poem is a marvelous genre, as we know. We are sustained by some of the great epics of this country, for instance, and the epic verse that emerged. But there are different times for different forms, I think. And what is interesting to me is whenever there is a ferment in language, whenever people are suspicious of ready-made language, that's the fertile time for poetry. It may not always give rise to an epic poem. Certainly, this is not the age, as you point out, for the epic poem. But I personally feel the need for a reprieve from stories. So I'm kind of personally quite glad that this is not the time for the epic poem, because I personally feel the need to hear the lyric poem a lot more today. As a reader, I'm not talking as a practitioner alone. At the same time, and this is the interesting part of what you mentioned, I think what the great epics, and not every epic poem is a great epic, but some of the great epics, what they've bequeathed to us is unforgettable, an unforgettable mythic inheritance. Those stories are not just regular stories where we talk just in terms of plot and character and so on. Those stories are actually capable of working almost medicinally. So I find myself in a lot of my own work going back to some of these mythic figures, whether it is Shakuntala, who plays a very important part in my book, When God is a Traveler, whether it is Muruga, Kartikeya, the god who's the quester, who plays an important part in the same book, whether it is Avvaiyar, the great woman, the crone poet of Tamil Nadu, who plays a very important part in my most recent book. I find these characters resurfacing because they're an integral part of our cultural consciousness. So it's an interesting thing to think about. At the same time, I will say that even while we speak of the lyric poem and its predominance at certain times, and certainly we see that today, I'm drawn to the haiku as well. I don't practice it, but I feel very drawn to the Zen haiku, and I'm very glad that there are all those blank spaces on a page as well. So each poetic enterprise has its own very specific impetus, and that can be just as fertile a time, I believe. The period, the time of the Zen upswing that we see, the great poets who emerge as a consequence, to my mind, are as creative and as exciting. They constitute a very important part of our poetic legacy globally.
Smita Kalikar, she has a comment as well as a question. Ma'am, indeed an enlightening session. Thank you so much for addressing poetry in your own sweet way. And her question is, what is your opinion on the death of the author/poet?
Are you going back to? I love the question.
I think this is from a student, definitely an MA student.
Yes. They're probably discussing the death of the novel. They're probably discussing deaths of various kinds. Yes, indeed.
That's a PG student.
It's coming from a place of literary. Yes. So thankfully, what I will say to that is, we speak of the death of tragedy, and we speak of the death of the novel, and we speak of the death of the poet. But there are times when, yes, it is true. In fact, there are times when the anxiety of influence is so intense, you feel there's no reason to write a thing. Everything that you needed to say has been said, and it's been said better than you could ever hope to say it. So why say it? And does the world really need you? Perhaps not. In fact, almost certainly not. But you begin to write because you just have to. That's the reason that it has to be. Whenever there is a strong inner imperative, you follow it. You do what you must. That doesn't mean you necessarily put all your work out there, but I think you need to follow that imperative, because the alternative is self-sabotage, and you don't want that to happen. What I do think happens is that one writes not out of this great sense of literary consequence. One writes not because one wants to be part of a canon. One writes because one has something, one wants to say something on a particular day. 1 year later, one finds one still wants to say it. And then there is the impulse to share it. To share it perhaps with someone else. To share it perhaps in a literary journal. To share it sometimes in a book. And as long as there are listeners for that, readers of that, in some way, the enterprise seems worthwhile. But one doesn't do it, and this is something that I think is important to tell oneself and remind oneself of, that one doesn't do it because the world needs it. One does it because you believe you do at this point in time. You need to respond to the world in this particular way.
Yeah, okay. Is somebody talking? Anidhi, can you please mute Aradhana, I think. And Shupant, if you're listening, I don't have your question. If you don't mind, please post it here. Read it out, Shupant. So we go to the next question, and I believe we have 11 minutes left with us. Arundhati, you tell me, you have to rush. Weekto can go on and on, but you have to tell me when I have to, you have to sound the bell for me over here. So we do have 11 minutes if it is going to be by 8 that we end. So the next question here is by Tejaswi Ramlingam. Good day, ma'am. That was an amazing, insightful session. Thanks to you. Well, my question is, as a poet, do you appreciate the levels of interpretation of your work / any poetry and its analysis being acclaimed?
And its analysis?
As a poet, do you appreciate the levels of interpretation of your work or any poetry and its analysis being acclaimed? I'm not very sure what she means.
Being acclaimed. Well, about the interpretation part, which is the part that I can respond to, I'd say that I'm absolutely fine with interpretation. And I'm in any poem that I read, even as a lover, reader of poetry, as I said earlier, there's a reason why poems have all those blank spaces. And there's really what we mean figuratively when we say read between the lines. What we're actually being invited to do is to join the dots in our own heads. But the important thing to remember is that a poem also offers you a certain framework, a certain matrix. And so the interpretation, your cues, your clues even, have to be drawn from the poem, not from just your own wild flight of fantasy. For that, you might need to write your own poem. But from whatever the poem is that you're reading or I'm reading, we need to follow the clues it offers us. We need to look at our interpretation within that matrix that it offers us. So I'd say it's important to remember that too, to do justice to the poem, not necessarily to the poet's interpretation, but to what the poem is inviting you to. So to keep that in mind, and then of course, certainly to interpret.
Okay. And Dr. Shupant Bhattacharya says, does poetic subtlety have a possibility of survival in these strident times of overstatement and loud rhetoric?
I love the question. And I hear you. I hear you. What does one say to that? I don't know. Sometimes I really don't know. And I wonder. One grapples with that, really. And on bad days, one feels perhaps it's not going to be possible to be heard at all and to make a difference at all to anyone. And then suddenly a reader appears somewhere whose response reassures you that somewhere it is possible still for connections to happen through language and pause. But I'd say this too, what keeps me going often is just this, the idea that one has a choice. The choice is, once you decide to write, the other choice is not to write at all. And sometimes I exercise that choice too. The other is, once you write, you have a choice whether to try and outshout the din or, and I think all of us feel we're living in this world where we feel more dinned against than dinning. But you have a choice to either try to outshout that din, which is just a deafening clamor, so it's not always easy, or to drop your voice. And for me, what works for me personally, and I'm just sharing this as a personal strategy, what works for me personally is to allow myself to drop my voice, valiantly keeping the faith that I will be heard. And of course, I'm not heard by many, but one is heard by some. And I think that's about as much as one can do, to walk along, singing humming your tune in the way that you want to hum it, not necessarily in an adversarial way with those who are choosing to lead lives of stridency and clamor, not adversarially, but still continue to walk one's path, saying what you have to say, the way you have to say it, the way you want to say it. And keeping the faith has sometimes helped. I have found listeners in unexpected places.
Neha Chaucer has a question. How much of a poem's understanding do you attribute to the subjectivity of the reader? Is there a lot lost between the intended meaning and the derived meaning in your experience as a writer of poetry?
It's an interesting question, and I wish I had a very personal, a very concrete example to share with you. But unfortunately, I can't think of a particular example now. But I'd say that I'm certainly not someone who feels that it's necessary for you to know the author's intent. I believe you need to take, as I said, take the lead that the poem gives you, not the author. So when I attend a poetry reading, it's interesting for me when a poet says maybe a line or two about a poem and then reads it. But is it necessary, for example, because I just read the Welsh critic poem to you today, is it necessary for you to know the background to that poem? I don't think so. And which is why I always try to, even in the line of introduction, I say the Welsh critic is a peg. It's actually a poem to talk about the wider, well, at least all the peeves that I've had, and I presume others have had, about those who give us dogmatic recipes and formulae and blueprints for belonging. And this can happen not just from Welsh critics, it can happen right here in the country that we live in. It can happen from all kinds of voices. Any kind of dogmatic voice, I think, is really the voice that is being addressed here. So the Welsh critic makes it particular, but I like to believe that the poem opens out to implicate every kind of dogmatism. So I would say that I hope that that is implicit in the poem itself. My talking about it may or may not add a layer to your understanding of it, but it doesn't matter. It isn't essential to your reading of the poem.
There's another question on the similar line from Razi R. What is your opinion on writers/poets forced to undergo phases of cultural amnesia in the present political scenario?
Well, cultural amnesia certainly, but also actual silencing. You know, it is active silencing. So these are very strange times. There are times of great possibility. On the one hand, we talked of the democratization that the social media and the internet technology has made possible. But there's also the kind of bullying that we've seen on another level, which perhaps is not unlike the kind of, this is the kind of widening that has happened almost overnight. You know, when you, at a time you knew your reader broadly, the readers of poetry, they were from all around the world, but you broadly knew the kind of reader you were talking to, or so you believed. And then comes a time when you have no clue who's reading it, who's picking it up, what sense they're making of it. And of course, the fact is that they're not necessarily readers of poetry, which means, to go back to what I said earlier, they're not reading the poem itself and getting a sense of what it is saying to you. They're actually imposing an agenda or reading an agenda constantly into something. It's a hard time. It's a hard time. It's a time of great transition. I like to believe it'll pass. I like to believe that there will come a time when we will find a way to move towards being inclusive, but not indiscriminate. When we will find a way to navigate what is currently a wild space. And I also keep the faith that it's possible sometimes to say your thing and not try to amplify it, to say your thing and leave it there. And it will travel in space and in time and will perhaps resonate with someone a long time later or in another place entirely. Every time that I have personally felt disheartened by the readership or the absence of it, this has happened to something that I may have written years ago. A voice surfaces that says, this resonates with me today. And that is the only way right now. I'm sorry, what is the name of the person who asked this question?
Oh dear. Rosina.
Rosina.
Yeah.
So Rosina, I would say that it's a very good question. But
Rosina.
the only thing that keeps one.
Rosina.
Rosina.
PR, yeah.
Yes. So Rosina, I would say that's the only thing that keeps one going. It's hard. It's not easy at all. Some things we write and we don't put out. Some things you write and you do put out, and you have to take the consequences of it as well.
And I think we are absolutely at the last part of this. Arundhati, give us 5 minutes more of your time.
Of course.
Because I'm going to make you read one more poem for me, for us, and also for Alamelu, who's here. You remember her, Alamelu, from our class? She's written, thank you.
That Alamelu. Of course I do.
Thank you, Arundhati.
Hello, Alamelu. Lovely to see
riveting.
you. I mean, lovely to hear you.
Yeah, and she writes, very riveting. Good to see you virtually, at least after 30 years. And so on that note, I think we've done with the questions. I would love for you to read your poem called My Friends.
I wonder if I have it. I think I will need to look at it.
It's
yes,
from
it's a
When God
lovely,
is a Traveler.
It is, and it's a good poem on which to end this particular.
Exactly. And I want to tell you this, and now I can, to your face, I marvel at the way you have memorized your poems, and you can speak them out, take out any, like a rabbit out of a hat, you take out a poem and you just read it to us. It is simply so awesome. I do not like that word awesome, but I can't find another word.
You know, Ruta, thank you for that. But unfortunately, this is a poem that I might have to read, or at least I will look at on occasion.
Please
All
do.
right, I'll try not to look at it too much.
No. I don't want to put you to any test. Okay.
But let me just say at this point, thank you. Thank you for this convergence, and all of you, those of you who've chosen to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this is a poem, it's a tribute to friendship. It's a tribute to friends who may not like to be described this way, but I always assure friends that this is intended to be an affectionate tribute to friends. And I'm fully prepared to have friends write similar tributes to me. My friends, they're sodden, the lot of them, leafy, with more than a whiff of damage, mottled with history, dark with grime. God knows I've wanted them different, less preoccupied, more jaunty, less handled with care, more airbrushed, less prone to impossible dreams, less perishable, a little more willing to soak in the sun. They don't measure up, they're unpunctual. They turn suddenly tuberous, but they matter for their crooked smiles, their endless distractions, their sudden pauses, signs that they know how green stems twist and thicken as they vanish into the dark, making their way through their own sticky vernacular tissues of mud, improvising, blundering, improvising.
Thank you so much, Arundhati. Like Lalita says, you are a goddess.
Who is Lalita Iyer? Is she here too?
She's not here, but I do remember her.
But that you do remember her.
I do remember her. I
voice
remember
from the past.
the voice from the past, and you are the goddess that she says that you are.
You've been very generous, Ruta, and thank you for bringing this entire group of people together. It's been personally very important for me to find ways of converging across all these barriers of time and space that this time has imposed upon all of us. And in some deep way, I think poems sounds, pauses. They have a way of traveling. And I hope that kinship that we all derive, that campfire that you've made possible today, will offer us enough warmth to take us through times that have still not, difficult times that have still not abated.
And your poetry, I mean, there are so many comments in the chat box. They all find you absolutely, it's been wonderful, they say. It's been an enlightening evening, excellent evening, and it's blissful. The words are blissful and elevating. And so all these friends that we have around us today, we've all come together on this particular platform and we are friends now. And thanks to you, Arundhati, we are now bound by silken ties of friendship, if not kinship. And kinship now, the new word for kinship can be friendship in troubled times.
Indeed.
In these troubled times, where poetry is the only saving grace, such as yours, will be that I want to. Thank you so much, all of you, for being with us. Before my colleague Nidhi Meshram gives the final and formal vote of thanks, I would really place it on record that we have had so many registrations, Arundhati, so many people joining us on YouTube, more than 420 registrations for this. Participants, thank you so much for making this possible. Thank you for sharing your time with us and Arundhati. And no, we do not have a feedback form, but do feel free to write to us on our email and share with us your thoughts about this evening. Thank you once again, Shaba Khair, and Nidhi, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. I, on behalf of the Department of English, seek this opportunity to first thank Arundhati Subramaniam, the Sahitya Academy Awardee 2020 for Poetry, to have readily accepted our invitation to deliver her perspective talk on what poetry means to me. Indeed, ma'am, the talk you delivered has illuminated and sensitized the minds beyond the literary territories. It has reiterated Dr. Sigmund Freud's proclamation that the poets and philosophers discovered the unconscious, who used their creativity as a sort of therapy and help looking the way back to reality. Your reflections befit in today's situation aptly. Our sincere gratitude are due to the management and office bearers of the Women's Education Society, especially Dr. Shamila Nayar, Dr. Narayanan, and Dr. Harsha Jharta. Our principal, Dr. Dipali Kotwal, is the motivator who empowers us to venture out in diversified spheres, has guided us to organize today's lecture in the memory of our English teacher, our beloved Dr. Kamala Narayanan. Our vice principals, Dr. Pooja Pathak and Dr. Alka, supervisors, Dr. Durgesh Nandini Tikarmare, Faculty of Humanities, Dr. Kiran Patil, Faculty of Science and Technology, Dr. Bhavna Khapekar, Faculty Head, Commerce and Management, the entire teaching staff of L.A.D and office staff involved in some form or the other needs a special mention of acknowledgement. Similarly, the continuous support that was extended by all the participants present today has encouraged us to undertake such endeavors in future as well. The audience comprising of the poets, the critics of poets, principals, vice principals, head of the departments, professors, associate professors, assistant professors, guest faculties from the English as well as other subjects, other professionals from diversified fields, our alumni from India and abroad. All those who were taught by Dr. Kamala Narayanan have only inspired us to collocate the talk. The retired staff of L.A.D, who were Dr. Narayanan's colleagues, Dr. Sudesh Bhokte, who has rendered his technical assistant willingly. We are grateful to Dr. Nutan Chotai, Dr. Rashmi Tikku, and Professor Dr. Vandana Pathak for their perpetual support. And the Department of English, comprising of its head, Dr. Ruta Dharmadhikari, Dr. Minakshi Kulkarni, Dr. Shilpa Sarode, Dr. Rupali Bhave, Dr. Dipali Gatkar, and Neha Thosar, Thank you all for being there always. Well, teamwork and humanhood also means poetry. At this note, I, on the eve of Independence Day and Narayan ma'am's birthday, consider today's meet to be over. Thank you all once again. Happy Independence Day in advance. Take care, stay healthy, goodbye, and see you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arundhati. Let's stay in touch.
Thank you, Ruta. Until soon.
See you soon. And for those participants, there is a feedback form after all. If you do wish to fill up the feedback form, thank you so much.